Hi friend, welcome to A Water Connection, a space created to learn, connect, and multiply the power of a conversation to give visibility to the water industry. I'm Jess Borges, a passionate human who believes that you should increase your water curiosity. Welcome to this new episode. Today, I'm joined by Associate Professor Bradley Moggridge. Brad is a Kamilaroi man living on Ngunnawal Country in Canberra. He's an environmental hydrogeologist with expertise in Indigenous Water Science, researching how traditional knowledge can influence the way we manage water. He combines the ancient knowledge of Indigenous environmental management with the advances of modern science to progress a sustainable approach to water and land management. We're very honored to have Brad as a guest to help us explore this connection precisely and inspire us to look at our water challenges in a very different lens. Welcome to our Water Connection, Brad.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Brad, as a Kamilaroi man and a water scientist, I would like to start with a very simple but profound question. For someone who might not be familiar with Australian Indigenous culture, could you help us understand what is the relation that Aboriginal and First Nations peoples have with water?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We got how long we got?
Oh, as much as you want.
Yeah, look, well, I suppose Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. It's second to Antarctica. We have 70% of the continent is arid or semi-arid, so a huge chunk. And we see most of our population on coastal regions. Pretty much the majority of our population, as in modern Australia. But Indigenous people of Australia, the first peoples, have connection back to 65,000 years. So that's sort of a number that we science has sort of put on our existence in Australia, but I suppose for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia, we see it as since day one. That we call it the time immemorial. The dream time is a common word used. It's sort of an English word used, but we all have because we also have a lot of diversity in Aboriginal people in Australia. So there's over 300 different nation groups, tribes, and then within that there's 600 odd dialects of language. So there's a lot of diversity. We're not all the same, and we all have different values and obviously different language and laws and governance structures, and so we're all very different. So I suppose for us, on the driest inhabited continent on Earth, with a long association with this place we call Australia, it's inevitable that if you don't know water, you're not going to survive long on this continent. And
That's right.
and I suppose that's the main connection, and especially how we value water is that without it you die, and all those sort of sayings, and our connection to the water places is existent in our stories, in our songs, in our dances, and very much oral tradition. So we also that plays a key role in our identity as well. So language forms a key part, and there are water places out there that dry up, and so that language disappears with it, for example. So water is a key part of our identity and who we are and our existence.
Yeah, and is it through these stories and like that knowledge that has passed from generation that, for example, Kamilaroi people or other Aboriginal communities would know where water is normally accessed from, like just from knowing country really well and knowing where would be the points where normally water is there at certain points in time?
Yeah, I suppose a lot of those songs and stories that relate to our traditional lands, are sort of like in encyclopedias and sometimes maps, and that those stories that are told and retold over generations are like our encyclopedia. So they are our evidence when we come to looking at managing managing our landscapes sustainably, because it's about our connection and our understanding of when and where water should be, based on stories. We've had development and, through colonization and, well, we call it invasion, for the 235 years ago, the English came, and we've had many non-Indigenous visitors to our shores and engaging with Aboriginal people across the country. But I suppose the arrival of English settlers to establish a penal colony in 1788 was a big shift and a big change to our existence. So our stories have been maintained, even though, colonization does what it does best, is it, it removes our identity and takes away our language and our culture. But I suppose, we had ways of keeping and maintaining language and song through our, passing on from generation to generation. A lot has been lost, no doubt, but still our connection to land and water is through our songs and dances, and that's through thousands of generations of observation and experience of what the Australian continent, delivers for humans and nature. So, we've seen climates change. We have stories going back to the end of the last ice age as sea levels started to rise. So, there's stories of climate survival already in our storyline. So, there's stories of volcanic activity, and Australia is a very stable continent, as in
Yeah.
we're sort of intraplate. We don't have, we're not on massive fault lines or volcanic activity. So, we've had a few hotspots, but I think, stories of those volcanoes are told and retold. So they're still in existence. So, that stories are very important for us.
Yeah, for sure. And I was preparing for this episode. I know that you, as a hydrogeologist, of course, you study a lot of groundwater. Is there a special representation for groundwater from the Aboriginal perspective, like places where, like, you can see that there's not a river, but suddenly there is water coming up, and how that comes to be?
Yeah. I suppose that heavily links to my first sort of response around our connection to water, because
Yeah.
as a dry continent, if there's no rivers, groundwater is going to be your only access point. And, because we're a dry continent, um, groundwater is a key part of survival, for one thing, but also, and with that survival becomes the connection, and then the stories and the rules, who can access these springs and groundwater. Wherever groundwater is bubbling out of the ground in, a natural spring or a mound spring, things like that, they are very significant places. So Aboriginal people would have placed huge protection, emphasis on these groundwater sites, because of, water, beautiful water bubbling out of the ground in the desert is something
Yeah.
that's going to be,
It's
you
live
want to
bubbling out
protect.
of the
Yeah,
ground, you know?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah.
And even for Kamilaroi people, like I have to be careful being a groundwater person. A lot of our stories are women's stories, so the
Yeah.
gender aspect of connection is important as well. So, there's definitely places in the landscape that I cannot go because they are, in women's places. Yeah.
Yeah, wow. And what are the best ways or the main ways that Kamilaroi people care for water? I mean, apart from like maybe having those places as like sacred and probably just, yeah, reserved for women, is there any other ways that the community cares for water on country?
I suppose, you know 300 years ago it would have been, protection, and there would have been rules about who could access certain sites and certain
Yeah.
places, and there would have been potentially, tribal wars over water, because we are a dry landscape, and there definitely would have been, conflict around water. But then as we moved into, post colonization, we're in conflict with the frontier and, landholders that were then taking Aboriginal land and putting hard hooved, like cattle and sheep and things like that, and then later we had camels, and so
Yeah.
we're up against it. To protect those sort of places is important, and on Kamilaroi country we're a fairly large sized nation, and I think we have 14 rivers and a number of significant shallow aquifers, but also we have the bottom end of the Great Artesian Basin, which is a huge groundwater basin that sits under most of northern Australia and into New South Wales, where most Kamilaroi people are. And, we have a lot of springs in our country. So protecting those places is paramount for us because of our connection to those places, and especially the women's connection here. Uh, Myself as a male, I have to do what I can to a point is in protect those places. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So in this description that you do of the Kamilaroi country having 14 rivers, is that connected already with the Murray-Darling Basin? Like, is that part of that area? I'm not sure
Yeah, yeah,
geographically.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
A huge chunk. I'd say, yeah, probably the majority of our lands, of our traditional lands, and our boundaries would fall within the Murray-Darling Basin. So,
yeah,
eastern seaboard of Australia, and mostly, the Murray-Darling Basin is about 1 million square kilometres, and
yeah,
New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, and Australian Capital Territory. So, there's a fair number of states and
yeah.
territories that are involved in its management, and yeah, we take a big chunk, especially the northern basin. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought of confirming first. I thought so because I remember the map you had in the conference, and I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that is, but I'll and the reason I was asking is because I've had other people that we have been having conversations about the River Mary, because I think is key to our life in Australia, and we have talked about how there are a lot of competing priorities that are always playing around how to allocate water. So I wanted to ask you from the point of view of like cultural value of water. Is there currently a provision for this in areas where you're aware of, like there is a provision for water there just to take care of the value that Aboriginal people have with water?
Yeah, I suppose the way we look at water from a management point of view, there's a number of I mentioned the states and territories prior, and then we also have a national water act that sits over the top of
Yep.
that, and then it brought in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and so we do. There are states and jurisdictions that that manage water as their own, but they're all moving towards to complying with the national requirement of allocation and take and the consumptive pool and non-consumptive and environmental water and all those sort of things. But I suppose for us as Aboriginal people, we're not really placed in that space. Um, the all the water all the water legislation is established to benefit the settler. It's not there to benefit Aboriginal people. We are well down the list in priority, and it's we've had review after review, and I suppose I try and when I present is give a little bit of a history of where we've come from in the truth telling of water in especially in you know around my traditional lands. So I suppose it's around when the colonizers came, they removed Aboriginal people from the landscape and, placed them on missions and reserves. This was a similar story in, probably they tried to do it in New Zealand and Canada and other places around the globe, the British. So I suppose it's, they placed us on mission reserves, took all our rights. And, for instance, like my mum's generation, they weren't counted as humans in Australia until the late 1960s. So, we sort of lost all those rights and access. And then what happened during those times was, the settlers took all the land, were allocated all the water to actually, do what they need to do, and
For all the
a lot
things,
of
yeah.
lot of irrigation and irrigated agriculture and things like that, and grazing of cattle. And I suppose Aboriginal people, when we emerged as humans, it's quite sad but funny, is that we, all the good land and water was gone. So I suppose to a point that once the systems are fully allocated, and if Aboriginal people are looking to then, get back as part of land ownership in a Western construct, you then have to seek water if you want to generate some sort of rural activity. And for us in the early 2000s, the system allowed for the separation of land and water into two separate entities. So if you had land back in the day prior to that, separation, you got water with it, and they were coupled together. And they were sort of like, if you sold the land, the water went with it. And then they decoupled those two things. And then now, if you sell the land, you can actually still hold the water, and vice versa. If you have water, you can actually trade that water on a market. And so they're both very much market driven.
Yeah.
And for Aboriginal people, we come to see that land and water are now separate, and our elders just don't quite understand why you would do that as a a custodian of the land, as in the crown. What they're doing is separating land and water, which should be together. But unfortunately, it further disenfranchised Aboriginal people because they didn't have the land, and then they didn't have the water, and
Yeah.
now they're getting land through land rights and things like that. But they don't have the water, so you've got to go to the market, and the market fluctuates. Like, we've come out of La Nina here in Australia, and I suppose it's been very wet the last few years, and so water is it's, pardon the pun, but the market is flooded with water, so you can water's going to be a lot cheaper. But we had two major
Yeah.
droughts, the late 1990s into the teens in the 2000s, and we had two major droughts, and water was super expensive because it was quite rare in the landscape. So for us, as Aboriginal people, if we want water, we've got to go to the market and buy it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And is there a provision for that to change at some point? Like, do you know of any initiatives? Because I know there will be some changes and reforms happening all the time. I would imagine
Yeah.
it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah. There was a review recently of the National Water Act,
Yeah.
but there was a lot of resistance. But ultimately, there was a small shift in that Aboriginal people's values had to be considered in water planning. So, prior to that, we have a National Water Initiative, which was signed off by all governments in Australia, all the states and territories, in 2004, and that sort of was the first time in sort of national policy Aboriginal people would be mentioned in water policy. So,
Yeah.
and that's up for review now. And so I suppose you got to think it's 20 years old, it's out of date, and you sort of want to push to make sure that Aboriginal people have access to water. But I suppose for our scenario is that a lot of these systems are fully or over allocated,
Yeah.
so more water is taken out than is coming into the
And
system.
it's coming
So
in. Yeah.
yeah, and for us, if we've got to wait to someone to retire that water or leave or put it on the open market, and you've got to engage a water broker like a stockbroker to go to the market and
Yeah.
try and find you water, and you'll pay top dollar for that. And we're probably, for Aboriginal people, definitely we're land rich at the moment, but money poor.
Yeah.
So I suppose through land rights and native title are the two sort of mechanisms we have access to land here, or Indigenous land and C Corporation purchases lands that may have water and things like that. But yeah, we don't really have the opportunity to buy water. And if you get access to water, then you're going to need the land to use it.
Yeah.
And obviously the infrastructure to move the water either out of the rivers or out of the groundwater systems to storages, and then you need the pumps and the pipes, and I suppose the
And the
infrastructure to do it.
infrastructure.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And then connected to this part of the infrastructure, like I know one of your main focus areas is to explore how traditional indigenous knowledge is useful, can be used for water management. Which of course at the moment is heavily skewed towards Western practices, and that's why it rings a bell when you talk about pumps and pipes and really traditional kind of infrastructure. How do we reconcile these two approaches when they could seem very opposite? I don't think they're completely opposite sometimes, but how do we reconcile those two approaches to water management that seem very different?
I suppose the biggest difference in the two and is definitely the way water's valued. And the value of water is, from Indigenous way of life and knowing and connecting to it is definitely it should be respected and treated as an equal, because it, without it, you're not going to. So if you don't have healthy water, you're not going to have healthy people or healthy country, or we call it country, but traditional lands, and you won't have and definitely won't have a healthy economy in a Western construct. So for us, the way we value water is completely different. In the Western system, as I mentioned, it's market driven, so
Yeah.
it's a dollar value. That's how it's valued, I suppose, in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is quite sad. And obviously, water that's left in the river or put onto wetlands or used for environmental purposes or ecological outcomes, um, the the system sees it as a waste of water rather than benefiting the water. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and for Aboriginal people, we're not part of those decisions as well. So, we're not
Yeah.
a key part of deciding when and where water flows from an environmental point of view, and for us, there's a lot of belief that cultural values will maintain a system. If you care for the cultural values, it will care for the environment and the people.
From the
So
environment.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly, that's a it's it's a change in the vision and how do you approach the water management that is very
yeah.
different. And within the research that you do, whether it's in Kamilaroi Country or somewhere else, because you have had knowledge of different places in the
Mm,
world, even, can you
yeah.
provide us some examples where like indigenous knowledge has started to be used for this water management?
Yeah, look, I suppose it's starting to pop up in places like New Zealand, with the Maori in Aotearoa, and obviously North America and Canada. There's opportunities in parts of South America we're sort of seeing. So we're seeing the rights of nature popping up. So
Yeah.
yeah, so the in New Zealand on the North Island, there's the Wanganui River, and it got rights to exist as a having similar rights to a human. So it got right to exist as a river and live its existence from the mountains to the sea and all that sort of stuff. So, those sort of aspects are popping up. And I think there's mountains in South America, and the Ganges or the Ganga River in India, it
In
has got
India. Yeah.
rights to exist. So that sort of part of law is popping up. Like, there's one example in Australia where the Yarra River, it's called the Birrarung in Victoria, so southern Australia, um, flows through the capital city of Melbourne, capital city of Victoria, which is Melbourne, and it has its own act, the Birrarung Act or the Yarra River Protection Act, and it sort of has its own right to exist as a river, and the Aboriginal people, mostly the Wurundjeri, are a key part of its management. So I suppose that's a positive example. We're seeing a shift in the way that river is managed, and the traditional Aboriginal people of that land are having a say in how it's managed. So they're a key part, not an advisor. They are a decision maker, which is great.
Yeah,
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 yeah, of course, because it puts right at the beginning the right of nature to exist. I think I saw
yeah,
a TED talk last week. I should have, I might, if I find it, I'll put it in the show notes. It was around that. It was around a river. I think it was in North America, and it was about giving it the right to exist, and then how was that the first step to actually bring a lot of the stuff that we have been losing through like industrial kind of focus and economy kind of focus in
yeah.
our society. That's right.
And
So
I just want to add to, just before we
yeah,
go on, that Australia is the only colonised country without a treaty with its first people. So we don't have that
yeah, okay,
that agreement from since colonisation to actually be part of the negotiations. Maori people in New Zealand have sort of um, have used the treaty process to get to a point of compensation of the land that was stolen from them, and they're getting access to land, but they've still got water challenges. But
yeah,
they're in a better place than we are, whereas we don't have a treaty per se in Australia. Yeah,
yeah. That certainly would make it a lot more hard, like harder in because it would be a lot. I would imagine. I don't know, like very localized. Like then you don't have like a group of people that is leading like from
yeah,
a national perspective.
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
pushing for
There's
those
no,
things, you
yeah,
know? Yeah,
yeah.
it's
There's no national mechanism. We're lucky to have, regional, state representation to have, and
yeah,
most of the time we're not decision makers. We're just advisory,
just
and
advising.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
not quite
yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah, it sounds for what we're talking that is some of the advances that we need to come from high up, you know, like from policy and things around that. But I wanted to ask you, what can we do to water professionals that might be listening to this to make sure that we contribute towards using this knowledge, that we use, that we don't let like the top down like just telling us what to do necessarily, but what can we do for people that are working kind of like in normal jobs with a lot of not a lot of power but a lot of will, you know, and a lot of
yeah.
desire to help in solving some of the current and future water problems.
Yeah, look, I think it's thinking beyond your area of expertise, but also being considerate of the thousands of generations that have walked the lands before you. Having a respect for that and thinking about how they may value what you're trying to manage,
Yeah,
or how they may understand, and then but also it's also for us as Indigenous people to almost provide the evidence. Like I suppose I've been very privileged through using research and as part of my part of my PhD, but also part of my research structure is to provide evidence so that my people can actually have something to bang on the table when they're negotiating. To
yeah,
be at the table because there's research there that's evidence that then can hopefully influence policy that then hopefully influences legislation and decision makers. But it's a long-winded process to get to that point, and some days you just feel you're not getting through to policy people, and they take it for granted. But I think it's especially in the Australian context, we sort of say and nothing about us without us. So if you're making decisions for Aboriginal people, but have the courage to stop the meeting and ask why there's no Aboriginal people in the room. Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah, a
for
little
sure.
thing like that. If you're making decisions for Indigenous people, wherever you are, or locally or regionally or nationally, um, you know, it's a simple. It takes a lot of courage, but I
Yeah,
think we need our champions beside us, walking with us as well. So um, and for a lot of Australian context, a lot of decisions are made for Aboriginal people without our advice or input. And so I suppose me becoming a researcher was moving myself as the researched to a researcher. So yeah, sort of flipping the paradigm to actually then start asking the questions that I want answered. That gives my people an opportunity to, as I said, bang on the table.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And I actually had that sentence that you just said. I had it in my notes because I remember it from your intervention in World Water Week, and it was just changing that research paradigm. Like we're not
yeah,
the
yeah,
objects of the research; we're out there researching, and I can imagine how empowering that might be. That
yeah,
would be for the rest of Kamilaroi people saying like,
yeah,
okay, we have someone else like leading the way there,
yeah.
and hopefully inspiring young people as well to follow your
Yeah,
steps.
definitely, definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I'll just thinking about that too. I think if we flip that paradigm, but also Indigenous people doing research with Indigenous people is sort of a new space, if you know what I mean. So,
yeah,
having Indigenous research methodologies as part of your ways of doing things challenges the system, and challenges ethics. Like ethics sees those sort of projects as high risk, but you're an Indigenous person, you're researching with Indigenous people, and you're looking for that co-design and co-delivery, and it's sort of working as a partnership. So Indigenous people aren't going to do the wrong thing by their own people. So
yeah.
ethics and science as well. Needs to evolve to accept these sort of scenarios, because at the moment we don't really science doesn't accept Indigenous knowledge. We're seen as a lesser, as in evidence and validation and things like that. So I think that for science it has to evolve and grow up. Like
Yeah.
the way I see it, my people were doing science before science was even thought of.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
And like and one of the principles of science is just being open to just
yeah,
finding other hypotheses and other answers to things. So
yeah,
it
yeah,
truly makes sense that he's like, well, let's use all the knowledge
yeah,
that it hasn't been coming from exactly the same like part of the history.
yeah, for sure, yeah.
So, Brad, what do you think is the biggest challenge that the water sector is currently facing that you think that Indigenous knowledge plays a key role?
I suppose the industry itself is, there is goodwill out there, and there's obviously still the resistance out there. So there's sort of those two scenarios, and there's obviously the group that maybe want to do something, but they don't know where to start or how to do a research project or partner with Indigenous community, and they feel they might say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, so they don't do it.
Yeah,
So I suppose there needs to be a bit of courage from the water industry to you know to reach out to Indigenous communities, especially those communities that are struggling to get fresh water, as a basic human right to their taps, or have
absolutely.
flushing toilets and things like that. So, the wash issues are huge in some of our remote Indigenous communities, and mainstream Australia will leave us behind, and then that sort of leaves us behind, with sustainable development goals, and then at international levels. But no one knows our challenges here in Australia because we're so far away, I think.
Again,
Yeah,
driest
we have,
continent.
and
Yeah.
yeah, we have some crazy, sad positions in Aboriginal communities. Where water supplies, are high in phosphates and nitrogen, but also, some communities have high uranium levels and chromium levels. So, these sort of challenges are in existence in Australia, but they're not really exposed at a national level because it's
Yeah.
embarrassing, and that
Yeah.
means it doesn't get exposed at international level, so we can't get the support and assistance that we need.
Yeah, of course.
Mm.
And what would be your message to young water professionals who might be listening to this? We touched a little bit on that before, but what?
Yeah,
Because the main conversations and the main audience that I've been thinking for these conversations is people like me that are we're kind of starting our careers, sort of,
yeah,
or what would be your message for us?
yeah. Look, I think there is. I know there's a lot of goodwill in the younger generations to do better. And I think we've seen that in Australia where young people are voting for more Indigenous rights, and that's part of the way they try and influence their vote in sort of elections and things like that. But also, that they may have visions and hope to work with Aboriginal people, and I think you can that's positive, but I suppose it's what happens next.
Yeah,
As a water professional, reach out to a local community that you maybe in your jurisdiction that you're working in, have a cup of tea, and sit down and have a chat. That there's a I have the three T's, as part of my, I suppose, tricks of tricks
yep,
tricks of the trade. So you need time. So you got to build in time to your research proposals to build trust
yep,
over lots of cups of tea. So they're my three T's.
yep,
So I suppose when you start having cups of tea, it doesn't have to be specific to your area. It's just a general chat, introducing yourself, and they're obviously thinking, they're looking at a young professional to say, is this professional fair income? Are they real for real? Sort of thing. Are they going to take our knowledge and for their own benefit and not benefit us? So
yep,
there's all those challenges that have happened before where knowledge has been taken and used for personal benefit rather than the benefit of the people that own that knowledge. So the
yep,
intellectual property, always remember that. And then you might get to a point where they might start having questions about their own lands or their own water systems that they want answers to, and you as a professional may be able to facilitate that. So it's
yeah,
then putting their questions in your research proposals,
mm,
rather than your questions. You know what I mean? So flipping that paradigm again as a researcher is and that's that part of that co-design.
Yeah,
and co-implementation, co-delivery, and having them all the way part of the research process. To then, when you're delivering the findings, they're beside you on stage at World Water Week, for example. You know what I mean?
that's
So
right. That's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they're part of the whole process. And I suppose there are challenges. Obviously, you some communities will just say, look, we're too busy with health, education, and everything else rather than
Yeah.
water. But I suppose it will take a bit of trial and error with communities, and you'll be told to go away, and that's fine. That's you got to respect that, and you move on. And maybe down the track they might have an opportunity, and they'll have your contacts, and they'll say, oh, remember that time you come in and wanted to have a chat? Well, we're ready to have a chat. And I suppose
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
it's having a bit of courage, but also allowing the time to build that trust, because
Yeah.
they've been burnt before, and they'll be very wary of a young researcher coming in to take their knowledge and get a PhD, and then they get nothing. You know
Yeah.
what I
Of
mean.
course.
So think about
Yeah.
that reciprocity. What's in it for them? Yeah,
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 I think that's a very good point. Like, and even modifying, like if it is a research piece, modifying the questions to include
yeah,
questions that the community has, because maybe that's something that, yeah, maybe not. It will be something that will benefit them. So it's not only about the questions that the researcher has, and that's part of the research
yeah,
part. Like
yeah,
I did a PhD in a completely different area, but the questions I had in day one were completely different to what I wrote in the
yeah,
document at the end. So in this case,
yeah,
if it was a research
yeah,
that is involving a community, well, you want that evolution, of course. But
yeah,
then, yeah, courage, time, and tea to build that
yeah,
trust. That is
yes, yep.
absolutely great tips. And then to wrap up, Brad, why do you work in the water sector and in this water science space?
Um, I've always been inquisitive, I suppose, as a growing up, and had a lot of questions, and I worked through, and science was a part of my interest, definitely in for a career pathway. I saw it as an opportunity, and as I said earlier, I've been very privileged to do the educational bit, but also work in some of the most awesome places, and go to some of the most awesome conferences. Like, yeah, last year went with the Australian delegation to the UN Water Conference
Oh
in New
wow, yeah,
York. So I went to that, and that was and then obviously World Water Week, and working with our Pacific friends that go over, and also then working with the Sami people, so to helping them to sort of pave a way to be part of World Water Week. And I think this year, hopefully, we'll see a real strong Sami presence. That's what we're hoping. That's only happened over the last couple of years. So I think there's hope there to build something bigger. And I suppose those international relations are important to support each other. And I think I get it. It feels great when you see some like, I think Indigenous people were part of the top 6 in the outcomes for World Water Week last year. So that's a huge shift just in that one conference. So I suppose having that shift in the space, I'll try and talk to as many people as I can. I present maybe 60, 70 times a year, just to schools, to to conferences as keynotes, if I get that opportunity, because I see it as even talking to you today, I see it as a
yes,
potentially new set of ears that I'm talking to, and hopefully those ears
absolutely.
listen. Yeah, and I think that opportunity, I see it as one of my um, goals in life is to influence people's thinking, but also change their thinking, and obviously think differently to do better for Indigenous people, especially. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely right. I was gonna say like conference keynotes and podcast, of course, as just as this one, because we're very happy to have had you here. And yeah, really is being that voice that has it back, like that has been doing the educational bit, but all the other things that are there as well to just be a wonderful inspiration for Kamilaroi people and for everyone. Like, so thank you very much for joining us in this conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
No, so good. And to you, my friend, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to this episode of our Water Connection. I hope you enjoyed this conversation that we have with Brad. I'll leave some links into it if you want to get in touch with him at any point in the future. Follow us on LinkedIn so you hear any other updates and episodes coming. But thank you very much and see you next time.